Ready, set, go. What is up, Chris?
How you doing, man?
Dude, I got to say, man, I'm grateful that you are here today. You take some time out of your afternoon. You're over here at AB Tech teaching a little course, and you decided to pop in and have a conversation with me. I wanted to start off and let you know, I guess, whether you know it or not, I wanted to thank you for the role that you have played in my collegiate recovery experience. The influence that you had, the unknown influence that you had, and motivation that you gave me. I met you, I want to say sometime in 2015. It was like my first semester at SEC, and you were doing something with Western, and you popped into one of Lori's classes. Mm-hmm. And at that time, I was new to recovery. I had 6-8 months maybe, kind of like going through the motions, but didn't really have a grasp on like where I was going with things. And you came in, you did like a recovery messaging with a little bit of your story and kind of like talked a little bit about who you were, but most importantly, recovery messaging. And at that time, like, you know, I think people in early recovery have this like, can get this perception that like we have to like change who we are, like our identity has to change. And for me, like I'm always been one to like kind of resist that type of like I want to be true to myself, right? That's why I fall in line with refuge recovery and found refuge recovery to be so important, because it was kind of like the rebellious way to go. And yeah, and so like here you are, you get up in front of the class and you're just like so genuine and so authentic, and you're just like presenting on a said topic, but you're being your true self. And like I could see that in you, and it was like inspiring to like hear where you came from and what you were doing, you know, currently and that sort of thing. And it really just like allowed me to kind of gain some momentum in the right direction.
Nice.
And then we had a couple other, you know, interactions over the years as you've popped in and visited with Western. And I wanted to start off by asking you, as you're driving in from Asheville tonight, and you're coming along the highway, and you get off on the exit, what's going through your mind? Like, is there some reflection on like where you've come from and kind of like, I'm back in Cullowhee doing this again, like the path to redemption kind of?
Oh, man.
Because it has to be just...
It's always really interesting coming back to this area. For those who don't know, I had attended Western Carolina in very active addiction and had to leave that institution. I also was at Southwestern Community College before I found recovery. There are just memories here that are so ingrained from active use. And actually, and you mentioned this as I was getting right off exit 85. The first thing that I thought of was my friend would love to see a picture of O'Malley's. And because she's always talking about their wings. I don't remember them having great, so I took a picture of O'Malley's for her. And that was sort of like, and it's just a weird thing for me to be like, here's this bar. But I really quickly, a few years ago, Western Carolina asked me to come and talk about my recovery story for a group of students, and some of the staff and faculty, and some associate dean of students was there as well. And I got done telling my story of being at Western and I mean, my whole high school, college, all of the struggles I had with substance use. And at the end, this associate or assistant dean, I can't remember, like, he didn't apologize for what happened to me at Western, but he said, we no longer treat students who are struggling like that anymore. And it was like this like really amazing moment to be able to come back to the school that had just nothing but negative memories, and to be able to share that story. Also, I ended up graduating from Southwestern Community College like 3 or 4 years in recovery. I came back up here and lived in Silva.
No shit.
Yeah, for about a year in recovery. And it was weird being back up here and without the use of substances and going to school and not missing class and doing really well. That was the most amazing thing about going back to Southwestern in recovery was I did really, really well. I was a straight A student, except for one B that I got in statistics. And that was another weird thing that happened was my statistics teacher at Southwestern Community College was actually somebody I'd gone to Western Carolina with.
Oh, wow.
Who had graduated from Western Carolina. And so it was this like weird sort of dichotomy of like, hey, I'm doing the quote unquote, I don't want to say the right thing. I'm doing where my path led me now, right? But here's a gentleman who graduated from Western within the 4 allotted years, and now he's a professor at Southwestern. And so my whole recovery, especially here in Silva, Cullowhee, even up to Waynesville and Asheville, has been really sort of marked by these dichotomies of active use versus my recovery back as a student, and then coming back to do some of the really amazing advocacy work I've gotten to do with Collegiate Recovery.
Mm-hmm. Kind of like a full circle moment, graduating from SCC and then sitting down here with me for the past 30 minutes and talking about Collegiate Recovery at SCC.
Yes.
Has to be like.
And the idea that that SCC, and I wasn't involved in any of this when I was a student there either time, but just in general that our institutions are becoming supportive of recovery. Because it was and is such a thing that we try to push into the darkness, both institutionally and just within our communities. So we might not want to talk about all this for whatever reason, but now here we see universities and community colleges stepping up and saying, no, we want to know about this. We want to talk about this.
And it's not just little like portions of the state of North Carolina, but it's like an entire wave crossing the state. It's not just like 1 or 2 colleges. You're seeing it all over.
And we have, let's see, 9, 10, I say 11 of our public universities with full-blown collegiate recovery or some form of collegiate recovery or on-campus recovery support. We have 5 community colleges that are just crushing it, and other community colleges. I'm hearing from community colleges I didn't even know existed all throughout the state. At least once a week, Surrey Community College reached out, Henderson, which Henderson and Hendersonville are 2 different places I've learned. Cape Fear Community College has reached out, and it's really cool that it's not just,
What so collegiate recovery is something that you are passionate about, and what you work for Addiction Professionals in North Carolina.
Yep.
Education director of education,
director of Scholastic Recovery.
Director of Scholastic Recovery.
Yes.
So what does that mean?
So I initially began this job, and it was Collegiate Recovery Program Coordinator. And in that role, I was offering technical assistance, technical support to our 6 universities that were initially funded by a grant, so many words, from a grant from the Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Abuse Services. And so initially I was just working with those 6 institutions, which still are, I apologize, UNC Chapel Hill, North Carolina A&T State University, UNC Greensboro, UNC Charlotte, UNC Wilmington, and East Carolina University. So initially the job was just working with those 6, either doing like really basic things, recovery messaging training or sustainability efforts, really basic stuff. And then we found out very quickly that there was a need for that same sort of support in the community colleges. Central Piedmont was one of the first to come to mind, SEC, AB Tech. And so I was able to expand beyond just those 6 universities. And so now I just get to do whatever university or college needs in terms of collegiate recovery support, whatever that looks like for that institution. And so we had this first initial wave of collegiate recovery, and then not sure, if you've seen it yet. Well, actually, yes, I think you were at one of the screenings of Generation Found at Western Carolina. And so then the recovery high school thing sort of hit North Carolina, and so I was able to then expand my role to all of Scholastic Recovery, doing that same efforts.
Okay.
for the recovery high schools. One hopefully opening in Charlotte. That will be opening in Charlotte 2019, fall of this year.
Right around the corner.
Right, yeah, absolutely, which is the Emerald School of Excellence. And then Wake Monarch Academy in Wake County in 2020, fall of 2020.
Back to back.
Yeah, so we'll have all of a sudden we'll have recovery high schools, and we hope that they're not only successful, but we are sort of mapping what the steps that they're taking. So when Greensboro and the Triad area is like, we need a recovery high school, and then Asheville says we want a recovery high school, we can show them the roadmap, much like we're going to be doing with Collegiate Recovery here in this next
You
year.
already have a footprint that you can say, hey, this is what we've done, this is what worked, this is what didn't work.
Absolutely. And what's really neat about North Carolina's Collegiate Recovery is out of those 6 initially funded universities, we had 6 very different models from inception to sustainability. And so next year we're going to be writing the story of each university, and we'll create a roadmap for, hey, do you want yours to look like this? Or how much support do you have from administration? Yeah. We have a roadmap for that. We have a roadmap for this, and we hope that that will sort of catch fire nationwide.
Looking at like what's your vision for this thing, and then having a model to base it off of.
Yeah, because what's been really interesting is like, so East Carolina University's Collegiate Recovery.
Shout out Jay.
Yeah, that's right. Shout out Jay. Looks nothing like UNC Charlotte. Looks nothing like UNC Greensboro. But they all have the commonality of supporting students who are seeking recovery or who are already in recovery. So there's enough similarities that there's enough similarities that they're all the same, but they're all so different. Like I can say, this is collegiate recovery, this is what it looks like, but then once we drill down, you start to see the individual differences.
I think one of the things that I've noticed in the 5 years that I've been at SCC is that like the fluidity of the thing and how it's always changing. We're kind of talking about how like some semesters we have like major involvement and some semesters not so much. They tend to show up for the social events more than they do for the support groups, and like what could we do different. And like at the community college level, it's difficult because so many people here at SCC like drive in. They drive in from Waynesville or drive in from Cherokee. So like it's a destination. They go to school, they go home. Life is going on outside, off of campus.
Yep.
So like identifying, like we still haven't, I wouldn't say like locked in like what specifically works. We know that for the social events, they'll show up. Like we do one social event a month outside of campus, out in the community, whether it's like bowling or hiking or camping, whatever we decide to do, they show up. We get 15 people, 12 to 15 people probably show up for each one of these events.
Yep.
On my Wednesday refuge recovery group, I'm happy if 1 or 2 show up. It's a good day, you know? So like identifying that, and people's class schedules are so different on a smaller community college level. You don't have such a smaller student body population, and they're trying to get in and out. So just like identifying what works best. And it might be something that we're not doing. It might be something like doing it on a weekend or off campus. You know, like having these types of like support groups or meetings, you know, somewhere else, doing something totally different.
I think one of the biggest misconceptions of collegiate recovery is because this worked at institution A, it'll work at institution B. Silva, Cullowhee, the western part of the state, behaves very, very differently than where I'm from in Raleigh. All North Carolinians, we don't all think the same, and we don't all see things the same. And I made one gigantic mistake really early on in my careers. I was out in the western part of the state talking about the resources that we had in Raleigh. And I didn't read the room very well, and I had said something about public transportation, and this woman stood up and she goes, "We don't have any public transportation here." She's like, "We can't do that. What are you talking about?" And I was like, right. And so creating creating the culture that the collegiate recovery culture that matches the culture of the community as well. The other thing I found out really interesting here when I was in Silva, just as a student in recovery, was I was attending 12-step meetings at the time, and I would go to a 12-step meeting in Silva, and it would be one person, and they may be twice my age. And so I wasn't really able to connect with the at-large recovery community here. And so I believe in those areas, collegiate recovery is even more important, because at NC State, when I was doing collegiate recovery stuff at NC State, man, there's 10, 20, 30 meetings within walking distance of campus every week, with young people attending them. And so to say that, oh, NC State does this, Southwestern should do that as well, would be straight up ignorant.
Yeah.
And you raise a good point too about, they show up for the social stuff, but not, you just never know what's going to connect with students that are turning over so quickly as well. It talked about.
Let me ask you this. Are there campuses that faculty are involved or welcome to participate? What type of, because I've had probably more interest from faculty who are in recovery.
That's really interesting.
And what's, you know what I mean? Just as far as.
So no collegiate recovery program that I know of currently does any sort of tailoring towards faculty. But I know, I was just at AB Tech, and Sharon was telling me up there, she said that they actually get a lot more inquiries about faculty in recovery than students currently. People just hey, what's up with this?
Yeah.
And so there's also a need for that as well. I keep hearing from people that more and more faculty are coming out about their recovery. I know at NC State, two of our biggest advocates were people in recovery for collegiate recovery at NC State, yet they were still hesitant to fully throw themselves in the same way students do. And I don't know if that's keeping boundaries. Should faculty and students in recovery?
What are the appropriate boundaries?
I mean, who knows? But the one interesting thing at NC State was there was a professor who was never able to make her meetings, and she kind of got sick of it, so she started a 12-step meeting in her own building.
Okay.
The entire time she was a professor there, it was just this Tuesday meeting at 5:30 p.m. She created it so she could go.
Fit it into her schedule.
Yeah, fit it in her. She said, what was that old saying? If you don't like a meeting, you get a coffee pot and start your own.
Yeah.
And so she essentially did that. And, she, as we began to talk about collegiate recovery, she had a really hard time understanding why students would need something more than just the on-campus meeting. And so we also see that sometimes as well. Faculty who came up in a different recovery pathway, and they like to keep their work and that part of their life and their recovery totally separate. So, it's, once again, no black or white. And the other thing too is, coordinators, collegiate recovery coordinators who are in recovery themselves. What is their role within collegiate recovery as a professional, but also as somebody who,
Yeah. That's something I've struggled with a little bit, just as my role as an intern for the program is confidentiality and what, as I'm having conversations with my supervisors, so I really having to use my best judgment, not on specifics of what disclosure, but just about what is taking place behind the scenes,
right,
in the student body. It's it's a juggling act, and I really have to look at kind of what I say and what I don't say. I have to be very cautious of what I say and what I don't say, but at the same time, our administrator or our advisor is a confidential, what do they call it, a confidential reporter.
Yeah.
So a safe place to go and talk and vent and things like that. So
Right.
it's there are layers of protection, I guess, but you know what I mean? It's just kind of one of those things where but we're figuring that since we just started it, a year ago. We're 3 semesters in now officially. We're kind of like figuring that out as we go, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the really interesting things.
So this is Kendall. She's going to snap a couple
Hi,
photos
Kendall.
of us.
Thanks, Kendall. One of the really interesting things, and I think that you may be experiencing this a little bit, is that sometimes we see students graduating from a collegiate recovery program and then going straight into the field of collegiate recovery.
Yeah.
And they have a hard time forgetting that now that they're in charge, so to speak, they're no longer a student.
Yeah.
So things I would have normally have said to a student, where I could joke around and kind of cut up a little bit, all of a sudden there should be a professional boundary there. And
You have a code of ethics that you're working underneath from the university or the college or whoever.
exactly like as a professional, you cannot say X, but I'm used to saying X to student, you know. So, and you'll notice I use a lot of variables in my examples because I don't want to throw out anything that sounds too specific. And I had the same challenge too, is when I first stepped into this role, even though it was a macro statewide role, I knew so many students at each university. And so initially I was spending time with the students and that felt comfortable. But now I've been in this role for a little while and I can't even name, students at universities by name anymore unless for whatever reason I've met them or worked with them. But
Thanks, man. Thanks.
yeah, that's it. But you're now in that internship role. So it's just really interesting how, as people in recovery who are passionate about collegiate recovery and are passionate about this whole thing, like all of a sudden we have to be professional in a place where we're not comfortable being professional. I haven't really given it a lot of thought, but as you brought it up, I'm like, man, it's tricky.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely.
It's figuring out, and I've talked to Lori a lot just over the last semester about we're at the point now where we need to start looking at creating an SOP and kind of looking at what we do and what we don't do and having it a black and white system, because stuff's come up,
And I think, so as when I was doing the collegiate recovery stuff as a student organization at NC State, one of the things that you find out very quickly is that when collegiate recovery is a student organization, things come up that are not appropriate for students to be handling. Mental health crises, reoccurrence of use, all of this stuff where it's, and a lot of times these are coming out of helping profession majors
Programs,
and stuff and programs. And as a social work major, I probably knew just enough to get myself and the other students into a whole lot of trouble, right? Even though I'd already graduated with a human services degree, I was just sort of in that next role of professional development, and I didn't know how to handle love triangles. It was like, hey, so-and-so did this, and now so-and-so, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't know how to handle. That's not something I ever actually even learned about.
They didn't train you on that, did they?
Nope. And nothing will bring collegiate recovery down faster than unrequited love. It'll get messy quickly. So good times.
When you were attending NC State, so you found recovery, and you enrolled at NC State shortly after graduating over here.
So, oh gosh. So I found recovery and didn't know what to do with myself. I couldn't, I worked as a barista at Starbucks, which when you're early in recovery is the job. It was unlimited coffee. It was flexible hours.
Decent pay.
Yeah. My boss was an Al-Anon. So I was like, I need to go to a meeting. She'd be like, all right, get out of here. So a lot of stuff happened, and somebody once told me in my recovery journey that I had never completed anything in my life except for treatment. And the truth is, I had never even really completed a full treatment. I had gotten kicked out of 2 treatment centers and left another one early. So I had actually never completed anything in my life. And so I came back to Southwestern just to get the 2-year degree, and that was going to be it, just the 2-year general ed. And I did it. I had a 1.7 GPA when I came back to Southwestern and was able to pull that up to a 2.1, straight A student with 1 B in statistics. And I found out that school was really easy when I showed up and wasn't under the influence when I attended. And so I met my now partner, Ashley, at a concert, and I moved to Raleigh to be with her and attended Wake Tech Community Colleges, where I got my 2-year human services substance use counseling degree. And then I tried to enroll into NC State, into the social work program at NC State. And NC State was like, hey, we noticed that you've been charged with a felony. We noticed that you have a DUI. We also noticed that you have like 0 leadership, and that you can't explain where you were for like 4 or 5 years. We would like some information. And so I told them, I started off my explanation letter by saying, you know, my name is Chris Campau, I'm an alcoholic, but it's okay, I'm sober now. Here's what happened with my arrest. Here's what happened with my DUI. Here's where I was. I can't speak to any leadership. And NC State told me that I can't go to school there. They just thought that's something else. And it was right then that I learned about Collegiate Recovery. It's a really long story, but I was able to attend NC State as a non-degree seeking student for a year to prove I could do the work, and I reapplied at NC State, and it was during that year of as being a non-degree seeking student that I started the Collegiate Recovery community. I started a student organization, and I received at the time, Stacy Matthewson grant, now Transforming Youth Recovery.
How did you get involved? Like, where did that concept or idea come from to
do collegiate
to move forward? Yeah.
So I was doing an internship at a facility that was now called Healing Transitions, used to be the Healing Place of Wake County. And my certified clinical supervisor, Chris Budnick, I went to him and said, hey, NC State's not letting me come to school there. And he said, I don't know anything about it. He's like, but how about for the rest of your internship here, you research collegiate recovery? And so at that same exact time, my friend at UNC Charlotte, Hillary Belk, who actually I'm staying with in Asheville this week, was doing the collegiate recovery work at UNC Charlotte. So I went down to UNC Charlotte and I said, what is this collegiate recovery deal? What is all of this? And so I started to get names and numbers, and ended up flying out to Texas Tech for a conference, the Association of Recovery in Higher Education Conference, the 4th annual one. And I met, Teresa Johnson from Kennesaw State, and Kristen Harper, who was at Texas Tech at the time, Daniel Fred from University of Nevada, Reno, and Matt Statman from University of Michigan, just all these collegiate recovery people from all over the country.
Back then it was
small. I mean, that conference was maybe 60, 70 people, whereas now we need entire gigantic conference centers to hold that conference. And I told everybody this story about how I couldn't get into NC State. And they said, well, why don't you just come to school here? Like, that's cool. Like, you're a great student. Like, we can see that through your transcripts. Like, you flew all the way to Lubbock, Texas for a conference. Like, we know you'll be a great student. And, but there were certain things that were keeping me in Raleigh, namely my wife's amazing job, my partner's amazing job. And at the same time, UNC Chapel Hill was starting collegiate recovery too. And Chapel Hill was like, oh, well, you could come to Chapel Hill. And I was like, no, I can't. I was like, I'm not a Tar Heel. I will never be a Tar Heel. Duke plays Carolina tonight. I don't want to start a whole thing. But so anyway, I don't know what the drive was, but I just thought that it was super uncool that I had done everything I could to eliminate the mistakes of my past. I had paid, my debts, quote unquote, and I was ready to move on and become a part of society with a 4-year degree. And I already had 2 degrees, and the fact that NC State just wasn't seeing it, was really frustrating. And so that was the real desire to start the Collegiate Recovery. A, for the recovery support, of course, but B, so that no student who has had my past, similar to my past, would have to go through what I went through just to get an education. And, you know, I ended up getting into NC State because the second time I applied, I was able to point to 3 semesters as a non-degree seeking student with straight A's. And the other thing I did is in my explanation letter, as opposed to saying, you know, my name is Chris Campau and I'm an alcoholic, I said, my name is Chris Campau and I'm a person in sustained recovery, which to me means that I have not used alcohol and other drugs since May of 2006. And I didn't beg for admittance. I said, other universities want me. I have done so much work for NC State as y'all were pushing me away to start recovery supports on campus for students. And I felt empowered. I didn't feel powerless for the first time in my life.
The ball was in your court.
It was. And if NC State didn't take me this time, I had letters with other universities' letterheads on them saying, we'll take them tomorrow. Some of the schools said with scholarship money. And NC State, the board understood that. And what's been really great is moving forward, as I've worked with other students at NC State, the board has mentioned recovery when asking for explanation letters from students with a felonious past, where they said, hey, you know, what are you going to do to protect your recovery now that you're on, if you make it onto campus? And like,
it's a priority to them because they understand the importance of having those things in place.
Yeah.
Is that itch, man?
Yeah, it's getting a little itchy. So
go ahead and share what happened.
Yo. All right. So for starters, I've got the dates nailed down. January 24th, I was on a lunch break bike ride, and I was pretending like I was 20, and I was trying to do this mountain biking course that was way too hard, and I fell and cracked a rib. This is not what I hurt my wrist. Exactly 1 week later, with a cracked rib, I was back on my bike, and I was going around a turn, and my back tire hit a patch of wet leaves, and I full-on Supermaned off my bike and bounced off the pavement and broke, pretty much shattered my right wrist. So I've been having a good time learning how to not become left-handed, but learning how to do everything with just my left hand.
No longer right hand dependent.
No, that's right. That's right.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
So what was the overall time at NC State, the time that you spent there? What were you able to achieve through collegiate recovery? Actually, let me step back a little bit. What changed? What inspired you to write that second letter and change your approach? Was it the empowerment from talking with all those other programs and having some confidence because you knew other people wanted you? Was it a skill, something you learned?
It was the perfect confluence of events. I would say it was the introduction to collegiate recovery that this was out here and that students were succeeding and being treated with dignity at universities. And the other thing that happened was the creation of the first and second annual Rally for Recovery in Raleigh. It went right along with the release of the film The Anonymous People, and recovery communities of North Carolina at the time didn't have a name. It was very slow, very early on, but we began with the mission of showing the Anonymous People in all 100 North Carolina counties and following it up with messaging, with community recovery messaging training. And I became a trainer for those messaging trainings. So I was going all around the state showing the film The Anonymous People.
I think that's when you came here and I met you.
Yeah, and then I was doing the community messaging training. And this was a woman who worked at the Governor's Institute on Substance Abuse, Jessica Herman, called me out of the blue and was like, hey, we want you to go places and tell your recovery story, and we want to pay you to do it. And it was so weird. And I couldn't figure out what she saw in me.
What are your intentions here?
Yeah, I was like, I was just, it was all very confusing to me. And she brought me out to Western Carolina, where I was able to tell my recovery story, which is where I met Christy Wyatt. And to be truthful, I was actually a very angry advocate back then. And Jessica Herman was like, we love your anger. We love your advocacy, but we're going to need you to chill out a little bit. We're going to need you to know when it's okay to be angry and when it's okay to, and she empowered me to come and do this work and to make me feel like I had value and this work had value. So between the anonymous people, the messaging training, Jessica Herman sort of teaching me how to not just be angry and yelling guy, all of that empowered me to say, NC State, you need me more than I need you. I have other options now. And at the very 36,000 foot level, at the very macro level, to me, recovery is really nothing more than having the choices, to not being so locked into this is my only option, to have the freedom to move jobs, to say, hey, I don't have to just stay here, or I can move, or I think that's really what recovery gives us more than anything, are just the options to live our life.
It's the clarity to see that that's available and to know that that's available. Because I found recovery, and 30 days later, after leaving treatment, I packed up my bags and I moved 3 states from Florida to here to start college, right? And in active addiction, I mean, I always had a good job, and I always, and my mom was always on to me about, you should go to college. You really should go to college. I think your brother did so good at college. You really should go to college. And it was always just I would have never even attempted to go to school, much less move 3 states away from my friends and away from my family. I mean, I was the drunken dude, I'm never leaving. I love this town. Tampa's awesome. I love the bars here. Yep. Ybor City. I was just I'm never leaving. I was that dude, Yeah. And then as soon as I found recovery and I saw what was out there in the world, and I saw these recovery communities that were taking place, and that was a big draw to what brought me to North Carolina, was the kind of recovery communities and things that were happening up here. But I would have never seen that. The thought wouldn't have crossed my mind.
And it's really interesting too. You were just talking about that. I was that guy. And I think one of the things that that lifestyle gives you is an identity. I had such an identity when I was a student here at Western Carolina.
I still hear about it, man.
And my parents came up for Parents Week at one time, and they were like, everybody on this campus knows you. And I was like, that was my.
It's a small town, Mom.
It is, yeah. And back then, Western was teeny tiny, but it was really who I was. I didn't know what life was going to look like if I shed that identity of party. Yeah. Party Chris. So.
Well, I'm glad you did.
Thank you. I am too. So are my parents, actually.
So what was you got into NC State, and you started the student organization. Yeah. What was your initial groundwork to build the program? How did you, because there wasn't a whole lot, you didn't have the resources available to you that say we do right now.
I would say we made one of the single biggest mistakes you can make with Collegiate Recovery, me and the co-founder, the gentleman who was helping me, was we became a strictly advocacy organization. We were 100% talking to provosts and vice provosts and directors and deans about the importance of not, we never talked about addiction, only talking about the importance of recovery. That when we had students who wanted to join, we would have parents who would call and say, hey, my son or daughter wants to get involved in Collegiate Recovery. We'd be like, great, bring them on. And we would instantly be like, all right, cool. Well, here's recovery community messaging. we want you to, next time you're in class and somebody uses the term substance abuse, or, somebody makes a comment about, junkies or, whatever, like, we want you to speak up. And I wish we had done a better job of just the peer-to-peer, what Collegiate Recovery really is. Mm-hmm. We were so focused on advocacy and getting recognition and building a program that we missed the most fundamental tenet of Collegiate Recovery, which is just supporting the next person in recovery. And, I hope we didn't do anybody any harm. Really hope we didn't do anybody any harm by not being able to be that support. But at the time, we were just so focused on the advocacy piece. And not just the advocacy, but filling out all the paperwork to begin the student organization. And at the same time, getting the Transforming Youth Recovery grant. And the other really interesting thing about that grant was at $10,000, and you were not allowed to take any administrative costs. Nobody on campus wanted to touch it because it wasn't big enough to bring into NC State. The kind of things I'd heard is that, we don't normally touch grants for less than like $100,000. And I was like,
so you had to sell it to them.
Yeah, well,
to accept it.
And fortunately, the social work department was like, oh, we'll take it, no worries, like, of course. And the social work department at NC State has always been really accepting of collegiate recovery, has always been accepting of the recovery student, the recovery story. And they too see it as a social justice issue as well. And the other interesting thing about social work is not traditionally great at dealing with addiction and recovery. So that's another avenue that we're sort of trying to move into, is social workers deal with problems that arise from alcohol and other drug issues. Yeah, like the majority of the time. And so, we're trying to do our part to educate social workers while they're still at the university level, so that they don't go out and start doing the work and then have to be sort of, unlearn what they've learned and then trained again in addiction and recovery services.
So many different avenues to pursue, from the advocacy work to the messaging training to the stigma to dealing with the medical providers so that they can it's just like, oftentimes I'm just like, I just throw my hands up. It's like, where do we even start? So many people come to this table where you're sitting that are doing like some of the greatest work in our state. I have these conversations with them, and there's just barrier after barrier, and they're trying so hard, but I'm doing this, but, and it's always just like, we kind of talked a little bit before we started, but like, how do we begin to collaborate more from agency to agency, from me, the dude in a Comfort Inn conference room, how do we collaborate more with each other? It's obviously, I think it's also just like a social issue that society is dealing with as its own. It's like, hey, like my label, I'm in recovery. This is my crew, my people. We are in recovery. And then there's, whoever, left, right, this person, that person. Everybody identifies with something. And it's more of like identifying like the differences.
So 20 minutes ago or whatever, I had made this really horrible comment about how much I hate the Tar Heels, right?
Yeah. Okay.
And I think that the ability to spot differences is so innate in every human being. The brain science points it out. Yeah. If you are different than me, I have immediate amygdala activation, which activates fear. And what we see is, and this has been a real issue in the professional side of this, is, group X, and here's a variable again, I apologize. Let's go ahead and say group R doesn't always play great with group P, who doesn't always play great with group T or group HR, right? We all have different ideas of how this thing should go. And because this isn't like a business where we can check like profit, right? Loss and financial loss and gain.
The impacts aren't as measurable.
Right. We all still believe that we're right. And I said, this is the way to do it. And I don't care if you disagree because this is the way I'm going to do it. And one of the biggest things I think in this field, both professionally and, at the layman level, is that we hold our work so sacred that anything else feels like a threat. I know that a lot of individuals in abstinence-based recovery see medication-assisted recovery as a threat, or just harm reduction in general as a threat. Syringe exchanges or safe injection sites, safe consumption sites as a threat. And it's not a threat. We're all wanting healthy communities. Like, I think if we just painted this all as like a healthy community situation, as opposed to I'm right, we need to do it my pathway, we need to do it my way, we may see some better results. But the other issue too is that we're always chasing grants, we're always chasing dollars, we're always chasing donors. And sometimes we, unfortunately, and I applaud people who don't, but every now and then you see a really great agency, quote unquote, sell their soul for the dollar to keep their doors open, just to keep their doors open. And it's hard. I presented at a conference yesterday, and we were talking about the opioid crisis, and this was at an aging adult conference. The Council on Aging Adults, I believe, was not my population normally. And some woman became so furious that she said, how come every time there's this brand new crisis, and she must have opiate, whatever other crisis, she goes, how come every time there's a crisis, my budget gets cut for the work I'm trying to do? And I was like, oh, no. And I made it really clear, I'm not advocating for anybody's budget to be cut to handle this situation. It shouldn't be either or, it should be and. It should be like, you get to take care of your population and your population who's struggling with opiates. We get to take care of mental illness and individuals suffering from substance use. We don't have to start divvying up the limited funds that we already have. We need to figure out how to use all of our financial resources and our bandwidth all together as opposed to separately.
And if you take a step back and look at it objectively, like it's an overall like health crisis, whether it's nutrition or substance use or depression or PTSD or whatever it is. It's a health issue. It's not a,
Yeah, and you still see so many people that are willing to blame people with substance use disorder. And I think we've actually seen a shift in that, where most people now view it as the brain disorder that it is when they're, talking. Yeah. But then like deep down, they're still like, well, why can't they just get it together? I just had this amazing opportunity to hear a young woman speak about being a pregnant woman who was using opiates, and the amount of shame. She said shame. I say bravery. To overcome the amount of shame that she was facing, to go and talk to her doctor and say, I can't quit using. What do I do to make sure I have a healthy baby? And to reach out for help. And she, through step down with medication-assisted treatment, delivered a baby who was free of any neonatal withdrawals. And the young one's over 2 years old now. Both her and Mama are super happy. And, I don't remember what the point of that story was. But it was just that I continued to hear these amazing stories. Oh, and she kept saying she could feel the looks of judgments, like if she loved her child, she could just quit. Even if people understood it as a brain disorder, they still believed that a mother would be able to overcome all that stuff. And all that does is just add layers and layers of shame, layers of guilt, layers of stress, which we all know lead to more recurrences of use.
Yeah.
That's a cycle.
Yeah, it's there's definitely a shift in it, within like national publication will write a story about Narcan, and then there'll be 1,000 comments underneath it talking about you're just enabling them. Why are you giving it to them? You know, so it's like you're seeing that shift, but it's like not as it's not happening as rapidly as we would like it to. However, I do think that there is, societally speaking, you're seeing a clearer understanding of like the disease model.
Right.
Now, I listened to an interesting podcast like 2 weeks ago on Sam Harris's podcast. He had a psychiatrist by the name of Sally Satel. It's worth going back and listening to. It's Sam Harris. The title is The Problem of Addiction.
Okay.
And she's a psychiatrist out of California, I believe. And she's her point was that we have the choice model, and then we have the disease model, and now like we've shifted it all. We're overemphasizing the brain disease model, and we're like not putting enough emphasis on kind of like the social connection and the social bonds and that sort of thing. It was an interesting perspective. It was something that I had not heard in all of the discussions of choice or disease. It was an angle that I hadn't heard before.
The social aspect of recovery. So from one of the most interesting things about 12-step recovery is that I found that the majority of things that the 12 steps figured out really early on, we're now starting to be able to back up with the neuroscience.
Yeah.
Like they were like, oh, you know, my aunt who's in recovery, at her home group, after 5 years of recovery, they'd give you your marbles. They'd give you a bag of marbles because it was at 5 years of recovery is when you got your marbles back. Right now, neuroscience sort of backs that up too. Is that, man, after 5 years, like a lot of that damage has been redone. Like your prefrontal cortex is back where it should be for the most part. You're making clearer decisions. And like neuroscience is backing up a lot of the stuff and one of those things about that social connection is, you know, the firing of the limbic system, right? That we used to get alcohol to do artificially. You get to oxytocin release and those hugs that you can get now in recovery, those actual connections with other human beings that used to be made through alcohol and were fake. I don't want to say fake, but because I have still plenty of friends that were part of my partying network as well. But you know how it was, like when you were just hammered and you're like, man, I love this guy, like he's my homie. And then you wake up the next morning, you're like, I hate that guy, right? But like now those connections are real, and you, without knowing it, you're creating accountability to the people in your life. And I think this social aspect is more than just the getting out of your own head or doing service work. I think there's really something to it. I'm not a person that is really touchy-feely. That's not who I am. But whatever that feeling is when I pick up my now 20-month-old daughter and she giggles, or she just, whatever it is that she does is a feeling that I can't describe, and I know it's just creating a connection. My brain is saying, hey, man, these are your genes. You have to do whatever you can to protect this little one. All the oxytocin release, all that feel good. It's remarkable. And if you can find those kind of social connections in recovery, the real meaningful social connections in recovery, you build that network of people that you would, I don't want to, because this kind of makes it sound like a choice, but if there was a situation where you got yourself into some trouble, you know, you could kind of lean back on saying like, nah, those people care about me, and I don't want to upset them.
Yeah. I wish that I kind of documented this process a little bit better over the last like year and a half, in like through journaling or whatever. But what's taken place in my personal recovery by just having this podcast, starting off once a week and now twice a week, where I sit down with somebody who I identify as like a leader in our community or an interesting person or somebody that's doing good work that I would just like, that I reach out to have a conversation like we're having today. Uninterrupted. The phones are on the table. We're looking each other in the eyes. We're just shooting the shit. But just doing that twice a week for an hour to 2 hours has elevated so many factors in my life, has elevated my moods and my perception of like my life and that sort of thing. And then to see the individuals who tune into the show and like while we're talking, they're having a little conversation down here and relationships are being built through watching this. And then to see them like out in the community together doing things and like making, so like the show creates those connections because they met through this little chat bubble, or because they were on the show, they were exposed to somebody else that's interested in the work that they're doing. It's been like this like domino effect to sit back and experience it personally myself, but then to watch it come to fruition out in the community has done more than like all those damn refuge recovery meetings that I went to, all those hours of meditation that I did. Now, granted, I wouldn't be here had I not done all that stuff.
Right,
so I'm not
right,
like,
right.
I'm not, you know, but I noticed a significant difference in the conversation, from the conversation.
And so just a little bit of personal stuff. When I was about 3 years into recovery, I left organized 12-step recovery. And the very first thing that hit me was how painfully alone I was, how painfully alone I felt. At first I was very resentful that none of my network was reaching out to me. And then after a while of reflection, it must have been scary for them. I thought that they were worried about me, but I realized that they were really worried about themselves too. And so the most important thing, and I think you were just talking about this, was how do I create a network of people that I can just like get down with? Yeah. How do I find, we use this term so much that it's almost cliche, but how do I find my tribe? And what was really interesting was I found a bunch of individuals who weren't even necessarily in recovery, but who couldn't understand at the same level, right? But were so supportive of everything I was doing professionally and personally, that it was remarkable how much creating my own sort of recovery network and what that would look like, and it not being, all just recovering people.
Yeah, you took yourself out of the box.
Yeah.
And you exposed yourself to the world of people who had similar interests, who you could create once you learned how to create an authentic connection, you're able to expand and open that up.
Yes.
And kind of walk out of the dark, smoke-filled rooms of the 12-step community and come into who you truly wanted to be.
And it was, and actually, I think I had a really good 12-step sponsor as well, because one time he told me really early on, he goes, if this relationship goes correctly, he's like, you're not going to need me. He's like, you're not going to need meetings for a recovery. He's like, you'll need those only to find the newcomers. And I don't think this was his intention, was for me to walk away. But it occurred to me that, my recovery, I felt more comfortable just with people outside of recovery, to be able to learn how to just come out and play in the regular world and not just in the recovery. But and at the same time, I get phone calls all the time from people who are like, I'm thinking about leaving 12 steps. How did you do it? Blah, blah, this, that, or whatever. I say that I don't live a normal life. Yeah. Like my entire life is recovery. I've been around people in recovery all day today. From what I was up to at AB Tech, down to here. The worst thing I've done today that was non-recovery related was take that picture of O'Malley's for my friend, right? But everything else has been recovery related today. So
yeah, you're living it. And also like being able to like expose yourself to those individuals and create those relationships with individuals that aren't in that air quotes recovery box. It's an opportunity for you to like be that advocate that you are professionally, and it's like own your recovery. Like, hey, I'm a person in recovery, and like this is how I live my life, and
Yeah.
we're homeboys, and you know what I mean? Like it's an opportunity to like advocate on a individual kind of personal level.
And I come in contact with a lot of people who haven't really run into recovery. I can't tell you how many times I'll be at a concert or a sporting event or something to that nature where people will just start saying things. They're like, oh, look at this homeless dude. Like, God, I can't believe blah, blah. If he could just get a job. Like really hurtful things. And like, I kind of let him go. And then I'll be like, yeah, I remember when I was homeless in Florida. And they're like, wait, you were homeless? And then I'm able to tell a little bit about my story, just a little bit about how I got to be a person that was experiencing acute homelessness, not chronic, acute homelessness, and the struggles I had. And I hope that those individuals walk away with just a different perception of individuals experiencing homelessness or substance use disorder.
Yeah. What how long after you graduated NC State did you accept this job at APNC?
Oh, it was 9 months.
Okay.
9 months of terror.
Applying for jobs and stuff?
Applying for jobs, and there had been like rumors that this position around Collegiate Recovery was going to be created, and I was like, all right, you know, if this job's going to open up, like I think I'll be perfect for it. But yeah, exactly 9 months after graduation, I took this position, and actually super lucky, right? Like
Timing.
Yeah, timing. One thing, if there's any students who are listening to this, just network. Create your professional network while you're still in school. The ability for me to have the contacts I had were far and away more relevant than, partially more relevant than some of the education I received.
But you didn't, like, they weren't just handed to you. Like, you worked for that.
No, yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't just be like, oh, let me meet all the right people. No, I had to get into the right meetings, into the right rooms.
Present yourself well, all those things.
Yeah. I had somebody tell me when I was at NC State, because I think I was like 32, 33 when I started at NC State, and I was talking to some traditional age students. And I was like, man, I feel so old, like blah, blah, blah. And they're like, well, you don't look old. And I was like, oh, that's good. They're like, look at you. They're like, you dress like a frat boy. And I was like, wait, what? They're like, with your khakis and your polo shirts and your visors. And I was like, oh no. Like, part of me was like, oh, that's kind of cool. You know, they don't see me as, but at the same time, I was like, I can't dress like this. I have to dress professionally. And that's another thing I think that, when we talk about recovery, we're not just talking about the, removal of drugs and alcohol or the removal of problematic behaviors. Now I'm no, sellout. Like I'm still gonna rock my beard, but if I want to be taken seriously in certain arenas, I have to present.
Fit the role.
I have to fit the role. And so when we talk about, one of the biggest kind of things that I felt ashamed of when I came into the field was I would go to these conferences and I'd be the only one that, and no judgment, like I swear to God, no judgment, but I'd be the only one that smelled like smoke or would have to leave to go smoke. And, I was finally able to give up cigarettes November of 2018, fingers crossed. And that was also partially due to, my daughter being born. But that was a huge sense of shame for me, was that I was at these conferences on addiction, and there was this huge addiction that I couldn't quit. And I'm always so strength-based and empowered, and I'm like, no shame in my game. But really, that cigarette smoking,
You felt a little bit of that.
there was a whole lot of shame there for whatever reason. So
I can relate, man.
yeah.
Quitting cigarettes was one of the hardest things I'd ever done in my life. It's way harder than crack cocaine. Way harder than alcohol.
Yeah, I feel like one of the biggest reasons why is because I had yet to cross any of my imaginary moral lines with cigarettes.
Yeah, I just recently started smoking again after 2 years.
Oh, man.
Of not smoking, just like a week ago.
Oh.
Dude, Lori Clancy, I love you. You are the best instructor that I've ever had. And I've learned so much from you over my 5 years at SEC. However, in my substance abuse counseling class, so I quit smoking cigarettes 2 years ago for the vape. I did the vape for right around 2 years. And about sometime late January, first week of February, I was like, all right, I'm ready to get off the vape. So I started doing the nicotine lozenges. Worked extremely well.
Right.
Like totally annihilated any craving of smoking. Like I was doing extremely well on them. Took like the higher dose 4 milligram one for like 3 weeks, feeling good about it. Dropped down to the 2 milligram, another 2 weeks, and I was like, okay, I'm good. And then I just switched over to sugar-free breath mints, right?
Yeah.
So I was like about 2 weeks nicotine-free, no lozenges, no nothing. And Lori drops this assignment on us. Okay, listen to me. 10-day challenge. I want you to give something up for 10 days. Because for substance abuse counseling class, if you're going to ask somebody to change a behavior, I want you to know what it's like, right? So the assignment is to give something up for 10 days and then write a paper about it.
Right.
So I had like been experimenting with coffee reduction,
Right,
because
yeah.
I'm like an all day, like fill the cup up, till I lay my head down. And so I was like, all right, 10 days. I just got over the nicotine. I'm like, 10 days, let's do coffee. I could do coffee for 10 days. I like drinking hot tea, So like the first 4 or 5 days, piece of cake, man. Fire up my tea kettle in the morning, drink a cup of chai tea or something, head out the door, and I'm good to go. And I didn't say caffeine free. I just said coffee free.
Right,
So like later in the afternoon, I could have a soda or, Monster or something. Bro, after like the 5th day, my nicotine cravings,
Ooh,
cravings just shot through the roof, like totally extreme nicotine cravings. And it had been a couple weeks without any nicotine whatsoever. So I bummed a smoke from somebody. You know where that goes, right?
Yeah.
You know where that goes. So it's been like about 10 days, and I haven't been smoking like a pack a day like I was, but consistently smoking.
Yep.
And so now spring break is over on Sunday. I'm going to be getting back on the lozenges on Monday. But it's just like how, so the lesson learned was like by giving up one substance, it made me aware of the cravings, or was filling a little bit of that need, providing that whatever.
Because you can absolutely tamp down one substance using the dopamine from another substance, right? Like the dopamine for somebody with a very affected dopamine reward pathway, that dopamine has to come from somewhere else. It doesn't have to. Excuse me for saying that. For some people, it has to end up coming from somewhere else. I'm always amazed at the individuals who, once they quit using drugs and alcohol, then say, you know what, no more sugar or carbohydrates because I feel that. No more caffeine or nicotine because I feel that. And their ability to eliminate, the large majority of the major mind and mood altering substances, sugar, caffeine, nicotine. My hat's off 100% to those individuals who are able to, through endorphin release or whatever.
They get
else,
it from exercise.
They'll end up getting it from somewhere, and it's always fascinating to me. Going back to Collegiate Recovery, I was at Virginia Commonwealth University, hanging out with their Collegiate Recovery community. And I was talking to a young man, and you'll see where this is going in a second. And I said, how's everything going? He's like, man, he's like 2 years abstinent. He's like, just crushing it, man. School's going great, blah, blah, blah. And it kind of got quiet. You know how like sometimes in those like early recovery, you feel that need to fill that silence. And out of nowhere, he goes, but you know what, man? He's like, I just spent my entire financial aid with a sports book. So he's like, I don't have any money to live on for the rest of the semester, and I don't know what I'm going to do because I've been gambling it all away. And I was like, oh no, right? And so one of the other really delicate things that you have to talk about in collegiate recovery, and I think about in early recovery as well, is once again going back into harm reduction and prevention of other high-risk behaviors, be it gambling, risky sexual practices, unhealthy eating, whether it be binging and purging, or restricted dieting, to really be paying attention to everything else sort of influencing young people. I mean, you're talking majority of collegiate recovery is non-traditional age students, but you still have 18 to 24-year-olds, and not only 18 to 24-year-olds, but 25 to 35 to 40-year-olds who may have some emotional stunting from use, some maturation issues from use, and the other things may flare up.
Yeah.
And the fact that it may be just turning off the coffee and turning back on the cigarettes, but it could be turning off the drugs and alcohol and turning up, other really risky behavior.
So in some of these like planning conversations that you're having with these major schools that have thriving collegiate recovery programs, is how do we incorporate process addiction type supports?
And it is a real sort of
We got technology and phones.
And don't even get me started on phones. We've gotten to a place now with phones where people are like, oh, I put mine in my trunk so I'm not tempted to use it while I'm driving. And I'm like, that's not digital recovery. That's, that is forced abstinence.
Yeah. Airplane mode, dude.
Yeah, that's right. I can't even imagine. I don't even put my phone on airplane mode.
What do you listen to?
Yeah.
What are you listening to in your car?
What's going on? But it's almost unfair. It's almost unfair to ask a collegiate recovery coordinator to then be a primary process addictions therapist and a prevention specialist on other risky behaviors.
But most of these bigger schools have
the counseling centers that can
in
deal
place.
with it.
Yeah.
And so the referrals at the universities are really simple. It's like, oh my gosh, your eating disorder has flared up. Let's get you to the counseling center immediately. Mm-hmm. Your gambling has flared up. This, that, or whatever has flared up. Let's get you into counseling. That is paid for by your student fees and your health insurance that you have as a student. Community colleges don't have the same level of staffing. They don't always even have counselors on campus. A lot of times, collegiate recovery at a community college is a student organization with just a very passionate, well-meaning advisor who may not always be a licensed clinical anything. They usually are, but not always. And so asking students or just your run-of-the-mill faculty to handle these situations,
it's risky business.
it really is.
When you're talking about people's lives.
It would border on almost unethical yeah.
And that's, I think, what I was kind of like hinting at the beginning of this conversation is like, what is the line? We'll know soon enough.
Yeah, and the other thing about collegiate recovery is even though we saw Brown University in the 70s, Texas Tech in the 80s, we are in the infancy of this. I mean, we're talking, having a handful of them in 2006 to now having more in North Carolina in 2019 than we did nationally in 2006, right? We're all learning together. We're all, I hate cliches, but we're all building the plane as we're flying it. I get calls and they're like, hey, I encountered this and what do you do? And I've never even heard of this problem. I've got nothing. Let me throw it out to, UCal Riverside. Maybe they know about it. And so being able to, creating blanket policies with our population is dangerous too. Mm-hmm. Like, well, you used, you have to leave.
Yeah.
We're literally the only group of individuals who will say, at the time you need the most support is the time we need to send you away. And so creating blanket policies around recurrence of use or other risky process behaviors, it's hard to make those blanket statements. You know, I think that's one thing that recovery high schools have done really well is take every situation as exactly what it is that students struggle, and is their willingness to change, is their willingness to re-engage, or are they just, you know, have they then become a safety concern for the rest of the community?
And that's how you have to look at it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and that's hard.
Because you're basing that off of the judgment of whoever's involved, whoever's making the decisions.
Yeah. Yeah, and we 100% can't. Yeah, go ahead.
You know, people are 100% unpredictable. You know.
Yeah.
Like,
Oh yeah. And I could literally sit here right now. I 100% sit here and say right now that I will never ever smoke again. Not smoking for these last 4 months has been so enjoyable. But let something come up.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden my tune will change very quickly. Be like, dude, I can just have one. You know, let me just smoke one cigarette.
I quit before, I could quit again.
Right? Yeah. Exactly. And I've had that thought. I'm like, well, maybe I could just smoke while I'm fishing. So, but that you just say that to say that this is all very unpredictable, and we need to. We can create policies, but we also need to be as flexible and adaptable as we can be.
You alluded to the fact that most students who participate in collegiate recovery programs are of the non-traditional demographic. Let me ask you this. With everything that's taken place over the last 5 to 10 years with this opioid epidemic, do you see an influx of traditional students finding collegiate recovery programs, and those programs really, because if there's 70,000 people overdosing last year, there's probably double that who will find recovery, right?
Well, and I had mentioned the non-traditional, and I haven't seen the numbers recently, but there's no way that's true. With just anecdotally, when I go to these programs now when I say non-traditional, that also may mean working a full-time job, non-traditional parents, commuting students. But in terms of age, we are seeing so much more in that 18 to 24. In the need and the emergence of recovery high schools paints that picture too. Is there's a great slide that shows the typical addiction career like 25 or 30 years ago, and the first treatment episode was 31, and I was just over a friend of mine is a halfway house manager or a house manager for recovery residents. And I was like, so what's the population like here? And she's like, every single one of these young ladies is under 22. All opiates. Opiates and benzos, benzodiazepines, Valium, Xanax. And so the face of addiction is getting younger and younger and younger. And I'm always curious as to, is it an awareness of the issues earlier on, or are we seeing our younger people, sort of hit some of those walls quicker? I had to leave Western Carolina at 19 or 20, whatever I was. If I left Western Carolina right now under those same incidences, would the mechanisms in place look different? Because at that time, it was like, man, you just don't show up for class and you're getting in trouble, leave, right? Would it have been like, hey, you're getting in trouble, you're missing class.
What's going on?
What's going on?
How can we support you? Yeah.
Can we send you to Red Oak, to Pavilion,
what do you need?
Yeah, so are the mechanisms different now that we're now catching these things earlier? Or are our students getting themselves into situations that used to take till you were 30, 35? Anecdotally, I would say that
a little bit of both.
A little bit of both.
Yeah.
There's an awareness now.
Do you think that with all this like hyper focus awareness placed on opioids, that some of the spotlight on alcohol and meth, even other drugs, is kind of like loosened to where?
Yeah,
Because anywhere you go, you hear addiction is synonymous to opioid use. Like that's today in this day and age
Yeah.
that we live in.
And what are we seeing? What are we seeing the growth of right now? The big business of marijuana, cannabis. I apologize. And I do not have a professional or personal opinion on cannabis. I know what it does to the brain. I know what it does to the developing brain. I also know that adults are adults. Make your own decisions. I also am sort of seeing what this microbrewery, this business of like drinking
Beer City.
Yeah, man. Like their microbrewers are everywhere now. And I remember the first time I saw the meme of the guy that said, "Oh man, microbreweries are great because it's making my alcoholism look like a cute little hobby," right? Sharon was telling me that AB Tech, or it wasn't Sharon, it was another person there, but that AB Tech now has a microbrewery course.
We do too.
Oh, do you? Okay.
Yeah.
And is that any different than like how to manufacture crystal meth? I mean, on some level, yes, but really, do you have to be 21 to get into the microbrew class?
That's a good question. I'm gonna check that out and find out for you.
And so we're seeing the proliferation, but there's so much focus and there's so much focus on, opiates being unintentionally addictive. It's like, oh, well, he broke his arm and this happened and now he's addicted to opiates. And the pharmaceutical companies, I get that. I do understand that, but I don't know if when 12-year-old Chris Campau drank vodka with his older cousin and her really cool friends, if I was like, I can't wait to become addicted to this. This is going to be awesome. That was unintentional. And this idea that, I picked up the first drink as a choice. Man, these kids were older, they were cooler, and all I wanted in life at the time was to fit in, right?
And it worked.
Yeah, man. Oh my gosh, I was so cool.
And still are.
I know, right? Thank you. But this idea of unintentional addiction through opiates is detrimental to the overall. And I don't know the statistics off the top of my head, but the amount of people we're losing to alcohol use, to alcohol-related accidents, other crystal meth and benzodiazepines. Hell, crack cocaine's still not great. Cocaine's not great.
Yeah.
I don't know why I just completely forgot cocaine was a drug.
That's exactly why we're talking about it, because nobody here, it's not on your radar.
And I rarely get called to do any presentation where they're like, hey, can you talk to us about the dangers of cocaine or alcohol or cannabis? It's all, hey, come talk to us about the opiate epidemic, opiate crisis. And people are like, oh, well, why aren't we suing the pharmaceutical companies? Or why aren't we closing borders? Or why? And there's no easy solution to. And even if we got rid of, we found out what happened when we got rid of overprescribing. People just moved to heroin. And one of these things about the older adult conference that I was just at is they wanted to know the mechanisms for addiction in older adults, as opposed to, like, I'm really versed in the mechanisms for addiction in young adults and adolescents and stuff. And so they're like, well, what's different in older adults where they become addicted at 50, 60, 70? And so I started doing research. I started trying to read the literature, and essentially all it came down to was people get addicted to drugs. Older adults get addicted to drugs because drugs are addictive.
Period.
That's it. Like, there was no difference in the mechanisms, right? It's all just dopamine and reward circuitry. Now, there's some chronic dependence issues around opiates that you don't see with some of the others as quickly, right? We all know that long-term alcohol use can cause that kind of dependence. But the physical dependence that opiates cause is very quick, and unfair, if you ask me. No drug should behave that way.
Ever. What's on the horizon for Collegiate Recovery in the state of North Carolina?
I would love to see a true focus on outreach. I like to look at collegiate recovery the same way I look at college football. It's a very strange comparison. But never once in all the years I followed college football, and by extension college football recruiting, which puts you into a different class of nerdy fan, like bordering on like you might need some help. never once have I ever looked at college football recruiters, Jim Harbaugh or Nick Saban or any, where they were looking at their own student population to find the best football players.
Ever.
Ever. Like every now and again, they'll find a kicker,
Yeah.
right? That maybe they're on scholarship from the soccer team.
You might hear rumors that like Jalen Hearns is upset as a backup quarterback and thinking about transferring and blow a phone call in, but it's not like top of your list.
No, absolutely
Yeah.
not. Like I was never once approached at Western Carolina or NC State, like, have you ever thought about playing football? And one of the things that we've done in Collegiate Recovery, for the most part, is we've only recruited from our own student bodies.
Let me stop you right there real
Yes.
quick. I'm almost willing to bet that one of the top questions that you get asked everywhere you go is how do we get people?
Mm-hmm.
How do we raise awareness for what we're doing on campus?
Yep, exactly. That's it. Well, how do we market?
How do we market?
How do we get students to come out? How do we? And so, as opposed to trying to find recovery in a campus of 30,000 students at NC State, why don't we go to where recovery is and let them know that collegiate recovery and education is an option for them? Because usually by the time at a community college, especially by the time you find somebody in recovery at a community college, it's their second or third semester.
Boom. See you
And
later.
they're like, oh, I'm super involved for a semester because this is great, but now I got to go.
Yeah.
Right. And some of the arguments I've heard against this concept is, well, not everybody who I meet in the recovery community is fit to come to college or university. Who cares? Like, that shouldn't be a deterrent. So we need to be out in our recovery communities talking to our people in recovery that if you want to go to college, if it looks like a 2-year human services degree, if it looks like just a 2-year associate in arts degree,
A technical school, a trade school. Yeah.
I was just talking to somebody whose son, just every time he would return to a university, he would have a recurrence of use. And finally he said, you know what? He's like, school's not for me. He's like, can I just learn how to be, he's like, I just want to learn how to weld. And so he's going to go to a technical community college just to learn how to weld. And hopefully the same level of pressure that he felt at the university, some of that same temptations won't be there at the technical college. But, you know, you don't have to go to Duke or UNC or...
You don't have to have a master's degree or
No,
a PhD.
that's not everybody's goal. And we need to listen and hear and then make sure that collegiate recovery, we say that collegiate recovery is inclusive. And if we're saying that, we need to not just be saying it because it's like the hip 2019, social justice buzzwords, inclusive, diversity. No, like stock photos of like the United Colors of Benetton on all of our advertising. Like we need to make sure that when we say inclusive, we mean inclusive. And we need to, and this is something I could be better at too, is when somebody says, I can't afford school, and really be up to date and know where scholarships are available for people. Really encourage scholarship funds at universities and community colleges for individuals in recovery because, while certain jobs, like I said, my Starbucks barista job was great and I loved the free espresso, the amount of taxes I'm paying back into my community now are much higher than I was as a barista, right? The amount I'm giving back to my community financially is much higher than it was then. Driving economic growth. And if we invest in our students in recovery, they will pay dividends in the long term, not just, and I'm not talking about just being good, good people, but paying back into society finally.
Yeah. And like even take it a step further and like create those relationships with like the therapist and the counselors and the treatment center so that like it can be a part of the treatment plan. Like, hey, have you considered going to school? And those private conversations, like, you know what, I would love to do blank. Oh, well, AB Tech has this program here. Like getting them well-versed in knowing that these supports are in place on campuses.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, like a few of the referrals that we've received at SEC have come from a local treatment center because I had had private conversations with them at the recovery rally out here at Lake
Yeah.
Junaluska.
Yeah.
I always kind of like, when first initial introduction, just, hey, how'd you hear about us, or how'd you find out about us? And boom, you know, it's coming from one of the treatment centers.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we sort of normalize that and say, hey, because here's the other thing too about treatment. Treatment is treatment. This is a highly safe space. And if you want somebody to like really get into recovery and love recovery, is, you know, pursue what you love as well. Like, don't stay isolated and scared. I had a counselor in treatment one time tell me, just heads up, follow Widespread Panic and Fish and Government Mule and all these kind of bands around the country. And I remember this counselor telling me, he's like, if you get into recovery, you can't go to those concerts anymore. And I was like, yo, I know how to be high and miserable. Like, I don't want to be sober and miserable too. and to then find recovery supports at those concerts, you know, like that was something that was really important to me. And if education is really important to you, learning how to live in recovery at a university, at a community college, while receiving support is invaluable for an individual's recovery.
Yeah. Well, you kind of hit on something that I did want to bring up before we close this thing out, and that is you have found a way to support your own recovery while staying true to the things that you're passionate about. You're going to all kinds of concerts, dude. Like every weekend, you got your 2-year-old daughter.
Yeah.
At these badass shows, you know, like you're doing the things that you've got to a point in your life where you understand yourself and you have the supports in place to where like you're not going to allow that to prevent you from doing something that you love, whether it's crashing your bike on a thing or going to, you know, a Fish show or whatever, you know? So like, what was that transition like? And like, at what point did you like, was there ever any like underlying fear about going back? Did you?
There wasn't. And I, when I started to talk about this, I want to be really clear that like my journey is not everybody's journey. And if there is fear involved in going to a concert or going to something, I don't want you to be like, oh, well, Chris did it. It's like
Dude, yeah.
It just meant so much to me. And this was the other thing too, is that last day that I used drugs and alcohol, and the drugs and alcohol quit working for me. I chugged 11 warm beers my last day, and I didn't get drunk. And then I used an Oxycontin and didn't get high. And there was such a shift in how I viewed my life. There was such a shift in how I viewed everything I'd done up to that point. I can't describe it. And so the first time I started going back to concerts, I went with people I'd found in recovery. I didn't know about, so like Widespread Panic has the Gateway, which is the recovery fans. Fish has the Fellowship. Grateful Dead have the Wharf Rats. I didn't even know about them yet, but I went with other young guys in recovery, and I found that the music took on a whole new feeling. It was all new. I'd seen the band Widespread Panic like over 90 times before I got into recovery, and it was like I was hearing them for the first time again. Same with Fish, same with Government Mule, and I was actually at the Asheville Civic Center for a Widespread Panic show in recovery, Halloween, October 31st, 2007. And I remember hearing the notes, like really hearing the notes, and this is going to sound so spaced out, but like, and appreciating each note, because each note was a new experience, and each note was like a new,
like time, like slowed down.
yeah, like, and it was fascinating. And I used to only be able to get to those places while on like hallucinogenics, and here I was able to get to that place in recovery, and that meant so much to me that I was able to still have these experiences, but they were new and enjoyable and memorable. And it was so weird. I will also say this, that while I wasn't afraid, my mother was terrified. And so one thing I did, even though it was kind of annoying, for her, I would call her before the show started. I would call her at set break, and anytime my phone rang and it was her, I would pick it up, so that she knew I was okay. And she told me later on that it took her 18 months of me being in sustained recovery before she was able to sleep through the whole night without worrying about me. And so while I wasn't afraid of my recovery going to places, I had to be mindful too that other people were concerned, because it looked like I was taking these really big risks. I don't know how many people are familiar with these type of concerts, but they're known for certain things. And there was a lot of fear for other people, had a lot of fear for me. And so part of my amends process really was to be available to them, to answer the phone, to put their fears to rest when I could.
And also like a little bit of accountability for yourself. Like, hey,
oof, I can't even, I just did that oof, that millennial sort of, I don't have words for what you just said, feelings thing. Oof. But I can't imagine how I would have felt after the third time in treatment if I was at one of those concerts and I would be using, and the phone had rang and it was my mom, and I would have been too scared to answer. Like, that would have crushed me, you know? So, you know, that's right, the other layer of accountability.
Having the people in place around you, having mom on the phone, like
all of it.
It's not, when you take a step back and you look at it, it's not as high risk as Chris went to a concert.
Right.
You know?
Right. And the other weird thing is being super hyper aware that you're in recovery.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I don't need to go do is hang out with the guys with the nitrous tanks, or I smell marijuana. Maybe I shouldn't go hang out over there. Like, just being hyper aware that you're in recovery. And I want to say this too, and I thought this was really amazing, is I drove to Chicago in 2015, I can't remember, the 50th anniversary of the Grateful Dead at Soldier Field in Chicago. And we went to the Wharf Rat meeting at Setlist, and I couldn't count how many, you know, the deadheads, like the real deadheads from like the 70s, the 60s, 70s, 80s, were at this Wharf Rat meeting. And I mean, it was in the hundreds. Like, the meeting was so big, like you couldn't even hear what was actually going on in the meeting, right? And it occurred to me that the individuals that had made it out of that scene and gotten to this side and were the kind of people that could travel to Chicago relatively healthy and stuff were the ones that had found recovery. And it's not true for all of them. It's a broad brush, but so many of them are in recovery and still seeing the Grateful Dead after all these years, with the acknowledgement that drugs and alcohol have killed so many of our musical heroes, like Jerry Garcia being, within my world, the one, right? So once again, we talk about dichotomies, right? We're all at this, the recovery meeting at a Grateful Dead show, where the Grateful Dead ended when our dark star passed away from drugs. It's a lot. Everything kind of comes full circle in those moments.
Totally does.
Yeah.
What's it like being a father?
Yo. There's no words, literally no words to describe what all of it's like. The fact that when I'm holding her and people go, "Oh my God, she looks exactly like you."
She does, dude.
She really, really does.
Your wife's probably sick of hearing that.
and it's fascinating to, more than anything, is to watch her learn, is to watch her be present in the moment, to understand that at that age she doesn't have language to think about fear, to think about anxiety. She just lives in every moment and just sucks in the experience. And to watch that and watch her start to connect the dots. She's gotten super into Star Wars, which...
Wonder why.
Yeah, right. And I remember the first time we were watching Star Wars and BB-8, the little white and orange circular droid came on the screen, and she jumped out of my lap and she ran to this book and found BB-8 in the book and was pointing and pointing at the TV. And every time she sees Chewbacca, she asks me to do this. She goes and points at me, and I do the Chewbacca roar, which I'll not do here.
We'll close the show out with that.
Yeah, that's what I'll do right there at the end. And just to experience everything through her eyes, being in recovery, being able to be present for her. And I can't wait to head back to Asheville, and I get to FaceTime with her this evening. So
Yeah.
it'll be awesome. It'll be great. So
That's kick ass, man.
yes, sir.
Well, we just did about 2 hours, bro.
Didn't even feel like it.
Yeah. Appreciate you again. Like I
Yes.
said, man, you've been a super inspiration for both my personal recovery and some of this business adventures. I could definitely say that we wouldn't be doing this podcast today had it not been for what you did for me, a few years ago, because it just, I wouldn't have been in the same place that I am today. So
Thank you for saying that. Means a lot to me. And I hate to keep one last thing really quickly is in this field, we burn out quickly because we don't always see the fruits of some of the seeds we've planted. We very transient, and to hear just things like that, make sure that we'll keep going.
yeah.
We keep going. So thank you for
It's
letting
so
me know
important, man. It's so important. Anytime that somebody affects my life, positively or negatively, I make sure to communicate with them and let them know in the kindest and most compassionate way that I can.
Yes.
But you definitely did do that for me. So
Awesome.
I appreciate you, bro. How can people connect APNC to
Yeah,
you?
if,
Collegiate Recovery questions?
yeah,
Social media? What you got?
Yeah, social media. I don't check Facebook as much as I used to, but my email address at work is CCAM as in Matthew, P as in Paul, AU@apnc.org for all your collegiate recovery, anti-stigma, and high school recovery needs.
Awesome. Chris, you're a badass dude. I totally appreciate you coming over, man. Thank you guys for listening to NC Raw. Y'all have a good night.
Thanks.